Welcome back, everybody. 28th Annual Phyllis Schlafly Collegians Summit. Hans von Spakovsky is with us next, and Hans is well known. He's often on my radio show. He's an expert, constitutional lawyer, expert on election law, served on the FEC. I was thinking about the Collegians, though. Almost every year, we've been doing this 28 years before we went virtual, Heritage Foundation would allow us to use their facility for at least one of the days, sometimes two. It's a spectacular facility. Heritage Foundation, a few blocks away, has this great, and they're such good neighbors to all the conservative groups that need a place, and they schedule it. So great to be with you, Hans. He's let me get it right, the law reform initiative, the election law reform initiative at Heritage Foundation. I like this better because we love Ed Meese. Is Ed Meese above me, behind me? Ed Meese up here? Up there, yeah, Ed Meese up top. The Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies. Hans is a senior legal fellow. Had been on the FEC, the Federal Election Commission, not committee, isn't it? FEC is committee? Commission. And back in the 2000, he's got a book, Our Broken Elections, How the Left Changed the Way You Vote. So welcome, Hans. How are you?
I'm doing great, thanks.
So it's a good business to be in, election integrity, after November 3rd. There's a lot of action. What's the state, when you watch the world of all the coverage, because you've seen it all, you've seen all this stuff come before the FEC. You've seen the litigation. Some percentage is just talk, always.
Right.
Let's just say it's 70%. Maybe it's 90%. Maybe it's 99%. But the 1%, after November 3rd, it felt like we weren't even allowed to ask about that. Just the way the media went, right? We were told, go home. You know, I know. Every election has some problems.
That's right.
And the key is that you don't have enough problems to make the election either wrong or so bad that people don't believe in it anymore, right?
Right. And now we're at a point where if you want to do a serious discussion about, for example, election fraud, and you want to talk about an actual case,
right,
where somebody's been proven
right,
to be guilty of fraud, if you do that, Twitter will take you down, Facebook will take you down, YouTube will take you down. You can't even talk about actual proven facts on this issue.
But the thing that's wild about it is, after 2016, the Democrats started complaining that the election was fraudulent. And for whatever reason, I know the reason, Twitter, Facebook, nobody took them down, and they allowed that to go on. So much so that by 2017, 2018, polling showed that 79-80% of Democrats thought that the 2016 election was a mess, right? Trump stole it. Right now we have a situation where 75% of Republicans think the 2020 election was fraudulent, right? So clearly you have a set of voters who, when they listen to their side, will be persuaded, right? Maybe that's nothing new. The question is, how do you go over the top of that and ask what really happened and what's a real concern as opposed to a false concern? For example, failure to validate signatures is a real concern, right?
It is a real concern, particularly because, as you know, in last year's election, liberals, Democratic Party, went to court and sued states to try to prevent them from even doing signature
and succeeded in some states.
They succeeded in some states, that's right.
So, that's real. The conversation about photo ID, that's been going on for 15 years. That's sort of the contours of that, to me, are regular. Same-day voter registration, mail-in ballots. There's real concerns. Here's what I want to know. We're talking Hans von Spakovsky. Go to heritage.org or heritage.org. And you'll see there's lots of writings there, but are we able to get real reform to address those concerns? Is that happening?
It is happening, and in fact, look, one of the only really good things that came out of last year's election is it finally brought to, I think, the public consciousness, and most importantly, to the consciousness of state legislators, the vulnerabilities in the election process that you and I have been talking about for years. We've been trying to get folks to finally remedy these. And now finally they paid attention. So we've had election reform bills, good ones, passed in Florida, Georgia, Arizona, Iowa, Texas is working on it, and they are putting in the kind of fixes we need. Just one quick example is, look, Georgia, as you know, has had a voter ID law in place now since 2008. It's been very successful, but it had one big problem. It only applied to in-person voting. Right. So they just passed an election reform bill that extends it to absentee balloting.
So, in the middle of that, I heard you, but in the middle of that, I thought, does anybody think that this will lead to a reversal of the trend? Meaning the trend, since you were on the FEC in 05, starting in 05? 06. 06. And I was the chairman of the Board of Elections in St. Louis, 05, 06.
Right.
At that time, the trend, which continues today, is for more early voting, more satellite voting,
Right.
more. There was a little movement for a little while for people said we'll vote online, but that sort of died off pretty much. But the idea of having 6 or 8 weeks, make it really easy. You put in St. Louis, they wanted to put in centers, 10 centers around the city, and
Right.
people could show up whenever. So you had people that were voting from election day back, sometimes 90 days, 60, 100. Is there any chance that this will whip into a movement that says, hey, let's have an election day again?
I'm afraid the trend is the other way. And I think that's actually a bad thing. I know people just love the idea that they can vote early because it gives them more time. But the problem with that is if you vote 2 months before the election and something happens,
right?
Some kind of information comes out about a candidate that would make you change your mind, in most places it's too late to do anything about it. This is particularly true when it comes to primaries.
Right.
Because I think about what happened last year. Remember, we had a Super Tuesday primary early March, just before the whole country shut down.
Yeah.
We had more than a dozen states that had primaries. And what happened right before Election Day, 2 days and 1 day before Election Day, Pete Buttigieg and Senator Klobuchar, who were running for the Democratic presidential nomination, dropped out.
Yeah,
they dropped out. If you look at the vote totals, however, many of those states in the Super Tuesday primary had early voting. They literally received hundreds of thousands of votes. Everybody who voted for them weeks before the election, they wasted their vote.
Mm-hmm. Could you? I know I agree with you. It's trending the other way. But if you're young people, you're 22 years old. We're talking to college students. That's
Right.
at Collegians Summit, and they just voted for the first time, maybe 2020, and they're getting ready to vote again. And they're seeing the system, and they're saying, "Well, you got to make it easy because I'm busy. I have a chemistry exam on Tuesday or whatever, right?" And all these things. But also, isn't there a pretty good argument that you want everybody to be voting on the same day to have an evaluation of what they believe at the same time?
With the same information.
Right, with the same possibility of the information. Right. And now what about this, Hans? I try this out on the radio, and John Schlafly, who's here with us, conservatives don't really like this, but I'm trying to find some way to spark us going the other way. What about making it a national holiday? Saying, okay, we're going to and by the way, let's give up another one of the holidays. Let's give one of the idiotic holidays, but pick one. But we won't make you pick that one. But to try to force us to make it something that says, make it a day. Any thoughts on that?
We could do that, but it probably
won't work.
It probably is not going to increase turnout.
Yeah.
Because in fact, look, the Census Bureau does surveys after every election, and one of the things they do is they ask people who didn't vote, "Why didn't you vote?" And the number of people who say, "Well, I just couldn't make it to the poll," is like a tiny, tiny fraction.
Oh, really?
The overwhelming majority of people, the reason they say they didn't vote was, "I'm just not interested in politics. I didn't like the candidates. I don't think it'll make any difference in my life."
Right.
That's just making a national holiday of Election Day is not going to change that.
Not going to change it. Okay. All right. Well, I thought I'd try. But all right. So our broken election system, your book, Our Broken Elections, How the Left Changed the Way You Vote. Is it broken?
I think it's broken to the extent that there are many vulnerabilities that need to be fixed in order to prevent fraud. And I'll give you one quick example of it. Right now, it's very easy for somebody to register in 2 different states and illegally vote in both states in the same election. That's illegal. But it's pretty easy to do, unfortunately, because states don't do a good job of trying to find people who are registered in other states.
Places, right.
And that's a problem that needs to be fixed.
I'm looking, back at my notes, and I'm sorry I got off the other question. If you were in charge of if you go back in time, and it was April of 2020,
right,
and you said, okay, I know what the left is capable of.
Right.
I know they've got 1,000 lawyers lined up. I mean, I think it was publicly reported they had hired 1,000 lawyers. And I think the Trump campaign had 3, or RNC had 8. And we know the groups that usually ramp up, but nobody ramps up to that degree. If you could go back in time, which maybe means if you could go forward into time to 2024, what would the Republican or conservative offensive look like to mostly be defensive maybe, but to make it an even fight? Because part of me says the Democrats just gamed the system using all the ways they knew how to game the system, which most of them were not illegal, even if they were legal maneuvers. In other words, you go into Montgomery County and you're a Democrat lawyer suing a Democrat county clerk, and you end up before a Democrat county judge. Well, you get a pretty good consent decree or agreement between the parties, and the judge says fine. You go up to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, all Democrats, and they say, looks like you all agreed. We're not going to mess with an agreement amongst the parties, right? And no one was there saying, excuse me, here's the objection on the record, so you can appeal it in a way that could be handled. I mean, go back in time. What should we be doing?
I would have tried to persuade states to call special sessions of their legislatures, and there they would have passed laws, for example, banning election officials from taking private funding.
Right.
Because remember, something like $450 million in private funding was set by Mark Zuckerberg to election jurisdictions, mostly Democratic urban areas.
Right.
Which helped actually, basically they moved their Get Out the Vote campaign into official channels. That's essentially what they were doing. I would also have the legislature reinforce the laws requiring an ID for absentee balloting. They would have banned election officials from simply sending out a ballot to every registered voter. I mean, there's a whole series of things I think they could have done, and they would have had to get their legislatures in place to do it.
So those are things that you would say now, and you're seeing legislatures taking them up, and they're moving on that. Is the H.R. 1 that's in the House, the Pelosi bill in the House, which we heard earlier comments, I think it was Congressman Pete Sessions was saying, it's really a takeover. It's a takeover, a federalization of election law, or not election law, but elections themselves, managing the elections. That's Pelosi's dream bill, right? It would be destructive. So tell me about that. But then, what's the counter to it? If you could wave your hand and say, "Here's what the Congress should pass," are there federal solutions on top of what you're saying should happen to the states?
Look, the problem with federal solutions is that for everything good that the feds could do, they could do something bad, and then it's going to be the rule in every single state.
I see.
And in fact, that's the problem with H.R. 1. H.R. 1, in essence, takes every bad change in the rules that occurred last year, cements it in place for all federal elections, and then puts even worse policies in. I mean, for example, states like Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, which now actually have a good voter ID law, those laws would be out the window. This federal bill, if it became law, would ban any state from requiring an ID when you vote. It's like they want to make our elections unsecure. They want to build in vulnerabilities that can be taken advantage of.
So your point is fight off the H.R. 1 for the reasons, but also be careful what you hope for, because a conservative solution may only be half of what you need and half of what you don't.
And it may be tempting. The thing to do is to stop what's going on in Congress, and then go to the state legislatures, which is what's been happening, and get them to pass good election reform packages like Georgia has done, like Florida has done.
And if California, now wear your constitutional lawyer hat, if California passes just horrendous laws, that are just like, it's just so bad, same day registration, no signature verification, no nothing, illegals can vote, they're allowed to do that to make their state a mess in general, right?
They are. And in fact, what H.R. 1 is trying to do is to Californiaize
the rest of the
country.
Make everybody do that mess.
Exactly.
But if you leave it the way the system is designed, if one state's going to be fraudulent, that's life. That's in general, broadly speaking, I guess. Okay, now we got these young people, college students we're talking to. The theme of this is the fight worth fighting. Tell students what they could do. If they care about this, they watched it, they say, that was a mess. I don't want to not believe in this system. What can they do? What can young people do in terms of the elections, in terms of that issue?
First of all, become a poll worker.
I do that every time.
Yeah, on election day, get paid to work in polling places, because if you're actually working there, you can try to make sure that the laws are complied with. If your state has a voter ID law, that's enforced. If you can't be a poll worker, be a poll watcher for one of the candidates or one of the political parties, whichever one you favor, because transparency is very important. We want poll watchers there to see everything that's going on, and also talk to and lobby your state legislator in whatever area you live in to pass good election reform changes. And in fact, the Heritage Foundation, February 1st, we put out a Heritage paper that's got a whole list of recommendations, best practices for election procedures.
The other question we're asking the guests, because again our theme is the fight worth fighting. This is one of the first after 2020. You know, you're a well-known guy. You're well-known as an expert. You've testified all over the place. People know to trust Hans and the books you write and essays you write and things. After this 2020, the world is a different place. Everybody gets a little more attention, positive and negative, to come up and say, what happened here? You know, you probably didn't years ago think, well, I'll pick the most controversial topic in the history of the world, elections, but here you are. But, you know, why do you keep, one of the questions is, what motivates you to keep up the fight? You.
Because I'm a first-generation American. You know, people hear my name, and they probably know that. My mother was German. My father was Russian. My mother grew up in Nazi Germany. My father escaped the communists twice. And I was born and raised here in Alabama, as a matter of fact. But my childhood was filled with stories from them about what it's like living in a dictatorship, how quickly your liberty and freedoms can be lost, and the key to maintaining our freedoms and our ability to have a functioning democratic republic are free and fair elections. And that's one of the reasons I work on it.
Have you written a memoir about that growing up?
I have not, but that's on my list of things to do.
You should do that. I think that would be. I think people that know your expertise and the quality of your presentation. How you're not a loudmouth. You're a guy that's level-headed. I think that answer that would inform that. That's really a great thing to hear, because so many people we're so blessed. You know, we grow up here and we see to hear it from your parents. Are your parents living?
Unfortunately not. But I grew up realizing, boy. Yeah, we have problems in this country, but this is a great country. There's so much opportunity and freedom here, and it's up to the public, the people, to make sure we maintain that freedom and that opportunity.
Yeah. I think I'm turning into like the Charlie Rose. I'm like, are your parents allowed? You should write a book. I'm getting turned into Charlie Rose. So, all right, Hans von Spakovsky, thank you very much. Again, Heritage Foundation's Election Law Reform Initiative. You mentioned a paper that Heritage came out with February 1st. Most of the legislatures are looking at Heritage saying, what are the policy issues we should do? So that's a good place to go. And, of course, Ed Meese, the great Ed Meese, the Center for Legal and Judicial Studies over there. Thanks very much, Hans, for all your help. And
Thanks
great
for
to
having
see
me.
you. Great. All right, we'll take a quick break, and we'll be back.